Last week we started painting this tiny IS-2 model. First we applied the Russian 4BO color using the zenithal light technique, then we highlighted the details, then we continued with the hand-painted markings, then filters, oil dots, washes, ambient occlusion, some speckling, brush chipping, some subtle rust tones, and we also painted the tools. In this video we're gonna continue with the running gear, some dust effects, and then we'll finish the model with some small final touches. What's up mates, Uncle Nightshift here. So, if you haven't seen the first video and want to get the full picture, there should be a link in the top right corner on your screen right now, and I'll also leave a link in the description. The model is about halfway done at this point, so let's not waste any time and get to work. Let me first see what can be done about this toy-like running gear. I first base coated the tracks with earth-colored Tamiya paint. It's called Flat Earth, so yeah, quite obvious. Trying to create any rust tones on those tracks would be pointless because I'm going to cover them with heavy layers of mud, because, you know, I have to somehow hide the lack of details. While I had the paint in my airbrush, I also sprayed some on the lower hull as a base for the upcoming mud tones, but we'll focus on the running gear for now and get back to the lower hull later. On to the actual mud. I decided the best thing I could do for these tracks is to cover them with textured earth, which is an acrylic product that can be blended with water. Yet I was still careful and made sure not to cover the track cleats, if we can consider those lines to be cleats. As you might think, this step is as fun as it gets, so let's use my editing powers and skip forward to the actual mud kung fu. The lack of detail on the outer side is easily hidden under a thick coat of mud, but the inner side of the track, well, let's just say I had a silly idea to actually simulate track details with mud. The point of this technique is to build up small patches of mud where each track link would normally be. I wasn't able to paint perfect shapes, but I don't think it's even necessary. The point is to have some volume and texture at the end of each imaginary track link, and the gaps between the mud clumps will represent the actual gaps between links. I know this sounds and looks quite ridiculous, but we'll just have to suspend our disbelief more than usual. I also added some extra mud to the outer edge of each imaginary link to make the illusion even more three-dimensional. After adding a little bit more mud here and there and also covering the suspension swing arms, I covered the entire assembly with a heavy layer of my custom acrylic Tamiya dust mixture. This paint is transparent and only serves as a sort of dusty wash. Then I added more opaque dust tones with the aqualine paint, which is an acrylic paste that can be blended with water. I brushed it in places where I didn't want to apply the textured earth, yet I still needed some opaque light mud tones. And then I just blended any sharp edges with small amount of tap water. With all the dry mud tones done, it's time to make the tracks really muddy. The most efficient way to achieve that is to speckle on large amounts of dark enamel earth tone. I really like this one for its desaturated color. Some of you might already know that I really like less saturated dust and mud tones. Needless to say, I was quite impressed how much this simple technique improved the overall look of the tracks. The choice of color is completely up to you, so if you for example like darker mud tones or you want some glossy effects as well, then go for it. I also added this paint to the running gear, although in a more controlled manner using a brush and not with speckling. I also blended the edges a little bit to achieve more natural color transition. And to give more definition to the tracks, I painted a large strip of dark mud right along the middle. This is a small, I don't even want to call it a technique, it's more like a feature. So this is a small feature which I picked from Adam Wilder. If you look at any of his models, he always does this, and I think it looks awesome. It's actually based in real life, because when the mud starts to dry up, doesn't matter if it's on tracks or wheels or even your shoes, it always starts from the outer side and the middle stays wet for longer. And now it's time to create some fake details, like legit fake. These track cleats are just straight lines without any detail, yet the real tank had 3 cleats on each link. So using a pencil, I'm making 3 dashes on each imaginary link. This represents metal that has been polished by rubbing against the ground. This can be seen on literally every operational tank, and I think the result looks quite okay considering the limited detail were provided by the kit. Let's do some more fake stuff. The inner side of the tracks gets polished as well, but in this case by coming into contact with the road wheels. There's again no detail here, so I'm painting small squares of polished steel on each imaginary track link. I'm sure this can be done more precisely, but this is the best I could do at the moment, as I had absolutely no idea if this is gonna look okay, or I'll just end up covering it up with mud, so as a result I got impatient. But I still think this is better than nothing. And as if that weren't enough, I also added more fakiness to the road wheels, which should be split in the center. So what I did was to first paint them with the dark earth color, and then I polished the outlines on each wheel. Not as a whole, but as if there were 2 wheels with a gap in the middle. Many of these fake details might look cringeworthy on your screen, but trust me, if you look at the model in real life, considering how tiny it is, it actually looks, well, not great, but not terrible either. I also felt that some of these polished effects were too strong and stood out like a sore thumb, so I covered them with a very light layer of my custom acrylic dust mixture. This toned down the shine and also smoothened out some of those imperfect shapes. With the running gear done, I then proceeded to weather the lower hull the same way. Most of this will be completely hidden behind the tracks and wheels, but it doesn't take very long to add all of these effects, and again, it's better to be safe than sorry. Now I could finally attach the tracks to the hull. This turned out to be a little more difficult than I initially thought, I guess because all the paint layers that I applied, which made the fit much tighter than it should be. But in the end I managed to push both sides firmly in place. And then again, using my acrylic Tamiya dust mixture, I started adding very light amounts of dust on the upper portions of the model. When adding dust to horizontal plates, such as these fenders, the technique is to tap the brush and carefully spread the paint without flooding the surface. After the paint is fully dry, you can repeat the process and add another layer, or another, and another, and another until you're happy with the result. On angled and vertical planes, it's all about painting fine streaks running from top to bottom. I gotta say though, I was very careful with this technique because of how small the model is, and I didn't want to accidentally create a heavy and monotonous dust coat. So if you by chance decide to follow this video on your own 100 scale model, I can confidently tell you that this technique is pointless. I'm gonna show you something that's way more efficient. And that something is brushing on small amounts of dust tones and blending them. It doesn't matter if you decide to use enamel products or oil paint, or, as in this case, Aqualine from Wilder, which is acrylic paint that can be blended with water. It's the same thing as I used on the tracks. With all of those light dust tones applied, we can now add more effects, starting with darker earth tones. You should always try to match the weathering that you made on the lower hull, because otherwise the model would look strange. This is also another way to add subtle contrast between details and individual components of your model in a very natural looking way. Natural. Get it? Because Earth is nature, so you're creating natural contrast. Whatever. Okay, so we can also add more gritty texture with, once again, speckling. You just have to add a little bit of enamel thinner to make the dark earth paint less opaque. And because speckling is a random technique, you'll always have to make some minor adjustments. Luckily, enamels are very easy to blend or wipe off. The photo which I'm using as a loose inspiration shows this tank with a pretty large grease stain on the left hand fender, and I think details like this can make your model really pop. I didn't want to make this effect too aggressive, and I totally wanted to avoid a fresh glossy finish on this stain, so instead of using some dedicated grease product, I simply used a dark wash from AK. The stain actually went all the way up, but it wasn't as dramatic as I'm making it. But again, I'm using the historical photo as a loose inspiration. Blending streaks in such a tight place like this is hard to film, but in the end I achieved this result. To make it even more gnarly, I also added some subtle stains using the speckling technique. Again, any unwanted specks were quickly removed with a paintbrush and enamel thinner. Using the same dark wash, I also added some leaking grease around the turret mount. Also note the dark stains around the fuel caps on the engine deck. Same technique, same product. And now using the dark wash for what it was originally designed for, I'm adding more definition to these air intake louvers. It's not like I didn't add any washes here before, but what often happens is that when you're adding dust or mud tones to your model, you can accidentally cover up some of those places which need lots of contrast, especially deep dark shadows. So as a quick fix, you just have to reapply the wash and carefully blend the excess. To make those simplistic external fuel tanks as visually interesting as possible, I decided to create heavy stains from spilled diesel fuel. Some types of diesel react with dust in a strange way, and they create this orange, almost rust-like surface. The effect I'm creating is heavily exaggerated, but honestly I don't care that much. I just want to make the simplified model as interesting as I can. One thing worth mentioning is that I haven't seen a single Berlin IS-2 with these fuel cylinders still attached. Every one of them, including the IS-2 self-propelled guns, had them missing. One of the finishing touches is to add smoke stains around the exhaust outlets. And this is probably the only time when you can see me using dry pigments. And also an interesting thing is that many modelers paint these IS-2 exhausts in rusty colors, while in reality they were solid steel castings and didn't corrode as much as sheet metal would. I also added tiny amount of black pigment on the muzzle brake, and again this is another part where some people like to go crazy. Yet in most cases just a few dark spots around those openings is enough. And the last detail, which I almost completely forgot about and actually noticed it while taking final photos of the model, is the machine gun. This was just painted with dark grey acrylic color and polished with graphite powder applied with this rubber sculpting brush. Now I just need to attach the turret for the final time, and we're officially done. So, what do you think about the finished product? I'm actually impressed by how fun this project was, and despite the limited detail, it looks way less horrible than I anticipated. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and also tell me if you'd like me to build more of these 100 scale models in the future, because I would be more than happy to do so. I think that's all I wanted to say today, so I hope you found this video helpful or at least interesting to watch, and if you did, please leave me a like and subscribe if you haven't yet, because I have more content like this coming your way. Thank you all for watching, I'll see you mates in the next one, and here are some bloopers. While I had the paint in my airbrush, I also sprayed some on after adding a little bit more mud here. I really like this. And to give more the finish, the inner side, and as if that wasn't enough. Using the same dark wash, I also added some leaking. I decided to create heavy stains from spilt. I just want to make this. And the last detail, which I almost completely forgot about and actually noticed it while And the last detail, which I almost completely forgot about and actually...